YouTube. Hey, what's going on, y'all? It's your boy Cal checking in with a new video. We got 15 largest abandoned cities in the world. Let's
There are
go and
nearly
see.
4,000 ghost towns in the United States alone, and many more dotted around the world. There's a good chance that wherever you are, you can live rent-free in one of these dilapidated towns, free of noisy neighbors. But while most of these places are small, some are pretty big abandoned places. Join me as we take a look at 15 abandoned cities in the world. Number 15. Ordo City, China. China has been through a lot in the last few decades. Much of the population has seen incredible economic leaps forward in short periods of time. But unfortunately, not everyone was brought up to speed, and that includes some cities and towns as well. China's Ordo City was an entire city built in the early 2000s to hold just over 1 million residents. But if
In the early 2000s, they outside, they partying and shit. I don't know how they see it, It's New Year's.
you were to drive down the streets tonight, instead of seeing a bright and sprawling cityscape, you'd be greeted with utter darkness, because in the nearly 2 decades Ordo City has existed, it houses just 1/10 of the intended population. Needless to say, the project undertaken by the Chinese government was a complete and abysmal failure that cost them more than
But why would they do that though? What was their purpose of? They said they was trying to house 10,000 people. Why would they build a whole city just for nothing to transpire from this? Like, I don't understand.
$1 billion
And then it
to
was like,
construct.
how do you, where they get the land from to do this? Huh?
The city spans 137 miles of dead quiet space, with many visitors saying that it feels like a post-apocalyptic city. Condo complexes and high-rises go on for as far as the eye can see, and there are still plenty of buildings that they started to build but just gave up on halfway through the process. Being in a country with nearly 1.5 billion people, Ordo City may be one of the few places you can come to for some peace and quiet though, as long as you don't mind being the only person for miles and miles in an urban environment. Number 14. Hashima, Japan. Also known as Battleship Island, Japan's Hashima Island was once the most densely populated place on Earth, but now, seeing as how it's on this list, it's totally abandoned, home only to the seabirds who come to roost there. A ghost town for more than 40 years now, Hashima sits off the coast of Nagasaki and was
40 years, bro. Like, how is this even possible? Like, honestly, how is this even possible? What made people like just abandon these places? Like, I'm not understanding. I need the backstory. Like, I need to hear some backstory.
built at the turn of the 19th century by the Mitsubishi Corporation. Japan had only opened its doors to outsiders in the 1840s, which allowed for all sorts of foreign trade, inspiration, and innovation, and the Mitsubishi Corporation wanted to be a part of it. Hashima was built close to the coal miners and their families, as it was believed that the island was sitting on a rich coal deposit. They quickly erected 10-story apartment buildings, courtyards, restaurants, and schools, everything a community.
Hi, dropshippers. It's time to focus on what you do best. So go to Wix.com.
Community would need to thrive on its own. And at first, business was booming, moving more than 400,000 metric tons of coal a year. But with all natural resources, the area's coal was finite, and when it ran out, many of the Hashima residents began to leave in droves until no one remained. And while Hashima has become a popular tourist site, seeing as how so many of the residents were forced laborers from Korea, perhaps it's best that this once thriving town no longer operates.
That's crazy. But it's like, you gotta get on a boat to get there.
Number 13. Bodie, California. For many Westerners, especially Americans, when they think of ghost towns or abandoned cities, their minds go straight to the Old West. And Bodie, California definitely fulfills that fantasy. When the California gold rush was going full throttle, everyone wanted to claim their fortune, and the city of Bodie was a great place to set up shop. It was close enough to the action, and in its early days had plenty of vacancies. But the thing about Bodie was that while it may have been a beautiful place in the spring and summer months, come winter time, things got pretty rough. Couple that with multiple disease outbreaks, mining accidents, and an incredible amount of crime, and you're looking at plenty of great reasons to get out of Dodge, or Bodie rather. Bodie, California really was the Wild West, and no amount of gold is worth your life. But like the modern dot-com boom and housing markets, the California gold rush's bubble burst, and so by 1882 no one wanted to live in Bodie, and the town went under, big time. Almost everyone had taken their ball and went home, while the few people who remained did their best to turn things around again. But it was pointless, and by 1940 the only residents of Bodie, California were tumbleweeds and dust. Number 12. Pyramiden. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, while many of the newly freed people were looking forward, many things were still left behind. That included the city of Pyramiden. This old abandoned city was a mining village in its heyday, sitting on an island that's only...
Wait a minute. So it sounds like y'all just in this thing for trades and mining. Like, that's all these places been, trades and mining. Y'all ain't trying to build no real cities. Y'all just want attraction and money. Like, bro, what is going on here, bro? Like,
accessible by either sea or snowmobile. Not really the type of commute most regular folks want to make. And seeing as how Pyramiden is on the Arctic Circle of Norway, it gets pretty damn cold there. But alas, there was a time when this place was full of people. It was founded in the early 1900s by the Swedes and sold to the Soviet Union for a pretty penny in 1927. And for the next 70 years, Pyramiden was mined for its coal deposits. It offered a great opportunity to earn an honest living, and so tall apartment blocks and public buildings went up for the workers, all of which are placed to form a circle with a statue of Vladimir Lenin smack in the middle, giving off a serious 1984 Big Brother vibe. But the once bustling city shut down in 1990 because no more coal means no more work, and no more work means no more people, plain and simple. All of the residents left just before Y2K and gave up their homes to the birds, seals, and even the occasional polar bear. Number 11. Akamara. Another former member of the Soviet Union, the city of Akamara in Georgia once housed 40,000 people. But if you go now, you'll see just a fraction of that number, as most people there are tourists coming to catch a glimpse of another abandoned city. Akamara was also a big mining town, but as the 1900s roared on and the new millennium began to rear its head, coal became less and less important. New technologies developed that gave us faster and better fuel sources at a fraction of the price. More and more mining communities were shutting down. But Akamara was also the victim of the siege of Karacheli in 1992. And as they were completely cut off from supplies, the town's basic necessities needed to be helicoptered in for 400 days. This was the beginning of the end here. Most of the buildings still remain, only with just a few residents each, and many of them look as though they're all ready to fall at any moment, because the infrastructure has been neglected for decades. There were rumors circulating in the country that this place could become a resort town, but the odds of that happening and getting the money are slim to none. Number 10. Hutuwan. Not everything needs to be all doom and gloom. Also known as the Green Village, the village of Hutuwan looks like China's response to the Shire, but in reality it's a long-abandoned town. About 40 miles outside of Shanghai, Hutuwan was once home to over 2,000 fishermen and their families. But the residents started to leave in droves in 19...
Y'all see that? Y'all see that? Damn, you know that junk run down when that junk got leaves and grass growing on the buildings?
90. Sadly, they were no longer able to meet the needs of the booming fish industry in China, so they decided to migrate to the mainland to find, hopefully, more suitable and lucrative employment. Unfortunately, this is a common occurrence in some of the...
Look at damn, that's crazy. I ain't never see. Damn, I mean, you do see leaves growing like on the side of houses and shit like, but you ain't never see it like this, bro. Like completely covered, like
the country's smaller villages. By 1994, just about everyone was gone, and that's when Mother Nature began to take over. Gorgeous, lush greenery absolutely took over to the point where you can't even see the materials of the homes underneath because the foliage is so dense.
Eve to me is basically freedom. It's a giant open universe where...
But for the select few villagers who did stay, they've been able to turn over a new leaf, pun intended, because the Hutuwan village is now a huge tourist attraction. and it is easy to see why. The greenery goes on as far as the eye can see. You won't find a town like this anywhere else. Number 9. Kolmanskap. You may have seen this next entry on our list pop up on countless Instagrams, as it's one of the most amazing sights you'll ever see, where nature reclaims man's work. Located in southern Africa's Namib Desert, its story seems all too familiar. The abandoned city harbors a rather interesting history. It all started in 1908, when a railway worker was cleaning the sand off the tracks when he stumbled across what he hoped was his biggest payday yet: diamonds. Instead of keeping the precious jewels to himself, he told his employer who kept the diamonds, not even offering his employee a reward.
Why would you do that? Why would you find diamonds and then tell your employee, hey, I got diamonds? Why would you do that? This is what you needed to get you off working.
Naturally, the word got out and a massive diamond operation ensued. In just 4 years, the city of Kolmanskap was producing millions of carats and diamonds annually.
Some people just don't be smart at all. Like, y'all just don't be smart. Like, bro, what? I'm not going to find diamonds and then let me at least get up a couple million. Let me at least get up a couple million.
Which added up to about 12% of the world's diamond supply. Once an empty desert, Kolmanskap was now the hottest place to be, with homes popping up everywhere, along with amenities like a post office, butcher, baker, and even an ice cream factory. Typically, when there's money, or in this case diamonds, there's greed, and much of the control and mining rents went over to a private German company who employed incredibly underpaid workers. By then, the condition of this place was awful, with too many people and not enough space, and eventually not enough diamonds, because the mine ran dry in the 1930s. But this mess of human greed and exploitation gave way to one of the most iconic abandoned cities around. Number 8. Bombay Beach. What was once a happening resort town in California is now a remnant of days gone by in the middle of nowhere. Bombay Beach sits 40 miles away from the nearest, well, anything. In the early 1900s, much of the Colorado River was diverted towards a vast desert area in California. The new body of water became known as the Salton Sea, and waterfront properties were built almost immediately. Bombay Beach quickly became one of the hottest places to live. But the new town also brought lots of farming, and the pesticides quickly found their way into the Salton Sea, killing just about all of the living aquatic organisms. Dead fish washed ashore, and the beaches quickly began to resemble a biblical plague. Tourist businesses tanked. People stopped coming to the beach, and vacationers steered clear of the bloated bodies of fish. Today, Bombay Beach is an abandoned post-apocalyptic shell of a metropolis. The skeletal remains of the fish are still scattered about, and the now brown Salton Sea is riddled with the stench. And that's not sand covering the beach, it's fish bones. So, should you stumble upon Bombay Beach, it's best to stay in the car and roll up the windows. Number 7. Tianducheng, China. For every achievement in infrastructure China has, there are a few failed attempts that they would rather forget about, one of them being Tianducheng, also called the Sky City. The construction of Tianducheng started in 2007 with the goal of essentially recreating the city of Paris. Everything was carefully curated, including the period-correct architecture, and there's even a 354-foot tall Eiffel Tower in the middle of the city square, a replica of the famous fountain from the Luxembourg Gardens, and even a French-themed amusement park. Tianducheng would deliver every bit of European taste and culture without citizens having to leave China. The city was built to accommodate more than 10,000 residents, but as of today, it hasn't even come close to hitting that mark. The city is generally abandoned, although it's still home to about 2,000 people, all of whom allegedly work at the aforementioned theme park. But why didn't people flock to this French-themed city? Well, it all came down to poor planning. Tianducheng is built in the middle of a rural area without an easy way for people to get there. It's all but cut off from the bustling metropolitan areas.
Look at this
The only
shit.
visitors to this place these days are the occasional newly wedded Francophiles and tourists looking for ironic attractions. Number 6. Krakow, Italy. Krakow is an old town that sits right in the arc of the giant boot that is Italy. The city actually dates back to well before 1060, and it's seen its fair share of armed conflict since then. Cruel monarchs, armies, and poor political ideologies have all done their damage here. And while man-made strife certainly made life tough for the citizens of Krakow, it was geological disasters that made things even worse. Things eventually got so bad that people began to leave in droves by the late 1800s. Earthquakes, floods, and mudslides all plagued Krakow to the point where living there was no longer safe. And by 1963, just 1,800 people remained until they were forced to leave Krakow for their own safety to the newly built town below. But the structures and streets are still there. Krakow has actually become a hotspot for not just tourists, but big-budget films as well, with productions like Quantum of Solace and The Passion of the Christ taking full advantage of the Italian ghost town's authentic feel.
That's crazy.
Number 5. Sanchi Pod City. The jury's still out on the existence of aliens, but the Sanchi Pod City in Taipei City, Taiwan may have you second-guessing things. Construction on these UFO-style homes began in 1978, in the hopes that this would become a seaside holiday resort, not only for the rich Taiwanese, but for U.S. military officers as well. And while the design may be strange by today's standards, this UFO style was cutting edge in the 1970s. The plans were in place for this city to live up to everyone's expectations, but it only took 2 years for this place to be all but abandoned. Unlike so many other cities we've seen so far,
Broadway and 33rd, please. You got it. Yo, my God, that's a red light.
this wasn't home to a depleted mine or the site of a war. The Sanchi Pod City is home to some really weird events, like multiple constructions inexplicably ending their own lives, various car crashes, and allegedly a slew of hauntings. It was bad juju all around, with many people believing that it was over a Dutch graveyard whose residents weren't too happy with their final resting place being disturbed. Others believed that a cursed ornament broke and the spirit wreaked havoc. But the most likely story behind the abandonment of the Sanchi Pod City was simply too high of a price tag, too much money and not enough people willing to spend it. Number 4. Burj Al Babas. There are plenty of places you can go to see an abandoned castle, but what about an entire city of them? That's exactly what Burj Al Babas in Turkey is. There's 399 of them to be exact. This place started out as a luxury housing development and ended up being a giant graveyard for Disney-esque castles by 2019, when the developers went bankrupt. As you can probably imagine, Burj Al Babas was aimed at the world's wealthiest who wanted a vacation home in Turkey, and a few even managed to sell, but not enough. And so most of the investors quickly pulled out, signaling the beginning of the end for this gaudy dream town. In the end, the development company owned $25 million worth, and since then the Turkish government came up with new housing regulations, which Burj Al Babas does not comply with, so now they're just sitting there, probably forever. But these developers are still hopeful, saying that if they can just sell 100 of these holiday castles, then they can whip their debt clean and move on. So if you do the math, each one of these castles goes for $250,000, but what good is a housing community without amenities? Burj Al Babas has an entertainment center and Turkish baths to complement the rows and rows of castles that will most likely never see.
What the fuck? They got a whole community of castles? Like literally, this house a castle, this house a castle, this house, and they all look the same. Nah, I'm cool.
See any use. Number 3, Centralia. Centralia, Pennsylvania was a great place to live. Another city home to a coal mine. There were jobs and opportunities aplenty, but all of that changed when a coal fire ignited quite literally underneath Centralia in 1962. But then why didn't they just put it out? Well, this isn't the type of fire you can just throw water on and go on with your day. The fire under Centralia has been burning for the last 60 years and will likely keep going for another 250 years. It all started when an attempt to clean the local landfill caused the coal seams under the surface to catch fire. And as you can imagine, most residents didn't feel very safe, so they left. And the fires weren't the only problems here, because these fires also gave way to a slew of sinkholes and released carbon monoxide into the air 24 hours a day. Eminent domain was eventually used to take control of the homes of the residents who chose to stay despite their own safety, but they all agreed to give their property over to the government once they passed away. The Pennsylvania government finally condemned Centralia in 1992, and while it is a ghost town, the highway running through it is given new life when it was once covered in graffiti and art in honor of the people who once lived there. And if you can find them, there were still 5 people living in Centralia as of 2017. Number 2. Kelso. There's nothing worse than being the best at something until someone younger and more innovative comes around, turning you into a relic. That's exactly what happened with locomotive trains. Kelso in San Bernardino, California was built in 1905 and housed 2,000 people who worked either the railroads, the mines, or iron processing plants, but mainly the locomotive train maintenance facilities during the First World War. Diesel-powered engines started to come down the tracks, putting the steam engine locomotives out of business for good, meaning there was no longer a need for maintenance and no longer a need for the workers. When the train didn't make that important stop in Kelso anymore, people left in droves in search of new work, perhaps on the diesel engines, and took the town economy with them. By 1985, the train had left the station for good, and the abandoned city had a population of 0. But it's technically still open for visitors with no one around to stop you from going inside the old post offices, shops, and homes to see what life was like for thousands of people in the early 1900s.
Went down like shit.
Number 1. Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. The country of Turkmenistan unfortunately has a tumultuous history, with many of its innocent citizens falling victim to forces well out of their control. A former Soviet Union country under the control of the horrific president Saparmurat Niyozov, Ashgabat was built in the hopes of creating a new prosperous era for Turkmenistan, a golden era for the country, and so the construction of Ashgabat began in 1991. Gaudy, record-breaking buildings were erected to show off the Soviet ingenuity to the world, mostly to the US. And in the end, 543 buildings were all made of luxury materials, and the newfound city was even home to the world's largest Ferris wheel. Meanwhile, though, in the rest of the country, life expectancy was at an all-time low. Today, Ashgabat was referred to as the City of the Dead because it appears to be so empty. The majority of residents live just outside city limits, and much of the city has no access to electricity or clean water. It's a very strange city that's mostly made of marble, but the fancy facade hides many dark secrets, and while it may be open to tourists, most of them will leave with a bad taste in their mouth. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink.
Hell nah, but nah, that shit crazy though. Y'all seen this shit? Pennsylvania right up the street. Nah, but they say it's just like a highway, like a little road or whatever. Nah, I'm cool. Would y'all visit any of these places? That's what I was just thinking. Like, would y'all visit any of these places? Because I know I wouldn't. I'm cool. You ain't about to... Bruh, as soon as you go there, it's going to be like a booby trap or something. Like, man, I'm cool.